My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 47 years old, a registered nurse by trade, a reluctant daughter by circumstance, and a mother by choice, not biology. I live 2 towns east of where I was born, and until last December, I hadn't set foot in Crescent Pines in over 6 years. That distance wasn't accidental. I left quietly, without announcement or drama, which is exactly how people like my mother prefer things to disappear, quietly and without a mess to clean up. But people have a way of calling you back when they think you've softened, or when they need something, or worse, when they want to remind you who still runs the table. The invitation to Christmas Eve dinner came handwritten on a red-foiled card, addressed formally. Miss Clara Bennett and guest, as if we hadn't once shared the same roof, the same cutlery, the same ghosts. I had left that house with more weight than I brought into it, but part of me, some mixture of guilt and defiance, accepted. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could return and leave again without unraveling. Maybe I needed to show Elsie the source of my quiet anger, so she could recognize it in others. Or maybe I just wanted them to see us, me and this child they tried to ignore, sitting upright and unafraid at their hollow little table. Elsie was 7, not mine by birth, but by blood, my late sister's daughter. After the accident, no one stepped forward, not even her father, who vanished as if grief had given him permission. So I did what someone had to do. I took Elsie in, and over the years, she folded into my life like she'd always been there. She came to me gentle and jumpy, always watching the door, always checking the locks twice. She hadn't spoken much for the first 2 months, but when she did, she called me auntie, until one morning she switched to mom without warning. I never corrected her. The drive back to Crescent Pines was quiet, just the sound of wind and her humming in the back seat. I kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the mirror. The deeper we went into the woods, the slower she blinked. She said the trees looked like they were thinking. I didn't respond. It was getting dark when we reached the house. The windows glowed, but the porch light flickered like it always did. 3 steps up, faded welcome mat, and a screen door that never closed fully unless you kicked it from the inside. Some things never changed, no matter how much you needed them to. Delilah answered the door before I knocked, like she'd been watching. Her hair was too tight, her smile too loose, and her voice thin enough to slice through the cold. She said my name like it tasted off. When her eyes landed on Elsie, she didn't speak, only stepped aside. I heard her exhale through her nose, the way she used to when I brought home stray animals or bad grades. I walked in with Elsie close to my side and my spine straight as the railing. The house smelled like pot roast and lemon polish, same as always, but under it lingered something faint and sour. Disappointment with a hint of cheap wine. We weren't given coats hooks or a place to breathe. Layla was in the dining room adjusting silverware like it was a competition. She looked up, smiled like she had somewhere better to be, and said we made it. I didn't reply. Elsie kept quiet too. Her eyes scanned every detail, window panes, picture frames, the chipped corner of the buffet table I once tripped over as a kid. She knew how to read a room faster than most adults, which broke my heart more than I could explain. Garth entered with a glass already in hand, cheeks redder than the wine, and clapped his hand too close to Elsie's head. She flinched. He laughed and said she was skittish. I didn't laugh back. We were told dinner would begin shortly, which meant 30 more minutes of thin pleasantries. Delilah asking about my job without waiting for the answer. Layla hinting at how hard it is to raise children these days, and Garth offering unsolicited advice about screen time and discipline. I stayed quiet, let them talk, let their words brush past me like a cold wind that couldn't quite stick. Elsie clutched my coat and whispered that she was cold. I said we'd only stay a little while. I told myself that too. When we finally sat at the table, it was exactly how I remembered. Long oak wood, nicked from years of knives and elbows, lace runner down the centre, and enough crystal to blind a person with guilt. Elsie had been assigned the corner seat beside the younger cousins, strangers to her. I moved to pull out her chair, but she didn't move. Her hand tightened in mine. I leaned in, softly asking what was wrong. Her answer came in a whisper so soft I nearly missed it. She said sitting made her hurt. The way she said it made me forget how to breathe. I asked if something hurt right now. She nodded, but her face didn't change. No tears, no whining, just stillness. The room carried on around us. Garth chuckled from across the table and said we always had a flair for drama. Delilah said posture builds discipline. Layla didn't say anything at all. I felt something shift in my stomach, like a thread pulling tight from the inside out. I stood up calmly. I told them we needed to use the restroom. No one stopped us. No one offered to help. We walked down the hall, my hand on her back, her steps small and silent. The guest bathroom smelled like lavender soap and mildew. I locked the door behind us. I helped her out of her tights. Careful, slow. What I saw didn't belong on a child's body. What I saw told me this wasn't new. I felt the world narrow to a pinpoint. I wanted to scream, to tear the wallpaper from the walls, to shake the silence out of every person who'd ever looked the other way. Instead, I crouched to her level and told her she did nothing wrong. Her lips trembled. I held her close and counted our breaths until they matched. When we returned to the hallway, Delilah was standing at the end with her arms crossed. She asked if this was really necessary, said dinner was getting cold. I told her Elsie wasn't feeling well. She made a sound halfway between disbelief and disapproval. Layla emerged behind her, eyes heavy with the effort of pretending to care. Garth remained seated, already on his second glass. I said we were stepping out. I said it without raising my voice. I took Elsie to the guest room, helped her into a soft sweater, handed her the bear, and told her I'd be nearby. She nodded, eyes glassy but dry. Outside, the air had turned sharp. I stood on the porch, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the call icon. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on my ribs. I'd made decisions before, clinical ones, urgent ones, but none that cracked me open the way this one did. I dialed. I told the dispatcher I needed help. I gave the address. I said I suspected abuse. My voice didn't shake, though everything else did. I stayed on the porch. I didn't go back in. Behind me, laughter floated out through the windows. The house glowed like it had something to hide. I crossed my arms to keep from trembling and waited for the sound of sirens to break the silence they all depended on. The EMT stepped past Delilah and disappeared down the hallway without a word. I remained in the entryway, feet frozen to the tile, as if moving might shatter whatever fragile order still lingered. Behind me, conversation at the dining table halted mid-laugh, replaced by clinking cutlery that tried too hard to sound casual. The second officer stayed at my side, scanning the room not with suspicion, but a kind of practiced alertness. Like someone who had seen dinners like this go wrong before, Layla emerged from the kitchen, her hands still damp from rinsing dishes, a dish towel bunched in one fist. She looked first at the officer, then at me, her expression brittle and composed in a way that betrayed the tremor beneath. "You brought them here," she said quietly, not with shock, but disapproval, the tone of someone inconvenienced, not concerned. I said nothing. My gaze stayed fixed on the hallway, tracing the invisible line between the bedroom and the place where secrets finally unraveled. The door to the guest room remained closed, but I could picture what was unfolding inside. Elsie sitting small on the edge of the bed, raccoon clutched to her chest, legs drawn in tight. The EMT kneeling gently, her voice calm and low, asking questions no child should know the answers to. I imagined Elsie answering with the same soft steadiness she used that night at dinner, her truth offered like a match in a room soaked with gasoline. When the EMT returned, her face carried the weight of certainty. She didn't say much, she didn't have to. She motioned for me to step into the kitchen, her eyes flicking briefly toward the others before settling on mine. I followed her past Layla, who shrank away without comment, her mask of composure slipping just enough to reveal fear. We stood beside the counter, next to a forgotten pie still warm from the oven. The EMT's voice was low, steady, and stripped of anything sentimental. "There are clear signs of repeated trauma," she said. She identified the abuser. She said it was Garth. I closed my eyes, not in disbelief but in grim recognition, as if the words had simply given shape to what I already knew. I nodded once and told her, please stay with her. She didn't need more direction. By the time I stepped back into the living room, the second officer had moved closer to Garth. He had risen from his chair, one hand resting lightly on its back, his smile fading into something tighter, calculated. "What's going on?" he asked, tone thinly veiled with feigned confusion. "Is there a problem?" The officer didn't raise his voice. He explained the report, the name given, the next steps. Calm. Exact. Garth laughed, a short, dry sound. "She's a kid. They make things up." His gaze bounced from face to face, looking for an ally. Delilah stepped forward, voice brittle. "This is a mistake," she insisted. "He wouldn't hurt her." Layla echoed her, barely above a whisper. "You're tearing the family apart." Neither officer responded to their protests. The cuffs came out. The click of metal on bone sounded louder than it should have, like the room itself was holding its breath. Garth didn't resist, but his expression hardened as he looked past the badge directly at me. I didn't flinch. I met his stare not with rage, but with resolve. Elsie stepped into the hallway just as he was being led toward the front door. She stood behind the frame, her raccoon held close, her face unreadable but steady. I crossed the room and knelt before her, careful not to block her view. "You're safe now," I told her. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." She didn't speak, but her fingers curled into mine, anchoring herself with that small gesture of trust. The front door opened. Cold air rushed in, swirling the scent of sage and sweetness into something sharp. Garth paused at the threshold, half-turned, his mouth twitching as if he wanted to say one last thing, but Delilah stood behind him, her expression carved from stone. "You've broken this family," she said, her voice clipped and low, as if the real betrayal had been exposing what she refused to see. I looked at her, holding her eyes as I answered. "No," I said, calm and quiet. "I protected what mattered." She said nothing more. The door shut behind them with a finality that seemed to ripple through the walls. The EMT gestured for me to bring Elsie outside. I lifted her gently into the ambulance. She didn't resist, only glanced around the interior with wide, guarded eyes. I climbed in beside her, accepted the clipboard, and signed where they asked. They handed me a pamphlet, standard materials, next steps, contact numbers, and I folded it without reading. The ride to the hospital was silent, except for the hum of the engine. Elsie leaned into my side, not speaking, not crying, simply watching the world blur past through the small rear window. At the hospital, fluorescent lights poured across beige tile floors and clean white walls. A nurse took Elsie to be examined. I was led into a small office where a counsellor waited with soft eyes and steady hands. I told them what I knew, what I'd seen, what I'd feared. I didn't raise my voice or let it crack. I stayed composed, not because I felt strong, but because I needed to be believed. I gave them everything, and when they asked if I had support, I said I had her and that would have to be enough. By the time we returned home, the sky had faded into a dull grey. Morning light crept over the rooftops in streaks of silver and frost. I carried Elsie inside, her body limp with exhaustion, and laid her in my bed. She stirred just once, reaching instinctively for the raccoon, then settled again. I stayed long enough to hear the rhythm of her breath smooth out. In the kitchen, I stood at the sink, staring at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. My phone was silent. No missed calls. No messages. Layla hadn't texted. Delilah hadn't asked if Elsie was okay. The silence wasn't absence. It was judgment. Their loyalty had already chosen its shape, and it wasn't shaped like truth. The folder from the hospital lay on the counter. I flipped it open. My name was typed beside temporary guardian. The word temporary felt like a dare. I closed the folder and pressed my palm to its cover, not in hesitation but in quiet defiance. Outside, frost was creeping up the edges of the glass, webbing into delicate patterns across the surface. I touched the window pane and whispered the promise I'd made the moment I called for help. Asterisk, Asterisk, no one touches her again, dot asterisk asterisk, and I meant it down to the bone. I didn't return to bed after making that promise by the window. It wasn't just about staying awake, it was about remaining present for what came next. Some choices rewire you. I moved through the kitchen with careful movements, collecting documents that had once seemed scattered and unrelated, but now lined up like evidence in a quiet war. The counsellor's notes, the hospital report, Elsie's drawings. I placed them all into a black folder and titled it, For Court. No frills, no hesitation, just a direct message to anyone willing to open their eyes. When I hit send on the email to CPS, there was no drama, no surge of satisfaction, just the awareness that this time the truth had been submitted with my name on it. I didn't reread the message. The subject line said everything. Protective action, immediate. I wasn't writing to convince, I was writing to document. And in that moment, I understood that the most dangerous lies were the ones that sounded too polite, Melissa called shortly after. Her tone was exact, every word clipped but not unkind. 1 o'clock, Riverstone Advocacy, forensic interview, bring the child. She didn't ask how I felt or if we'd make it. She assumed we would, and I needed that kind of certainty. I thanked her, though the words felt more like muscle memory than gratitude. Elsie was already awake, sitting on the hallway floor, raccoon in her lap. She looked up when I crouched beside her, and I told her we were going to a place where people listened. She didn't ask for details. She just nodded. That nod was heavier than it looked, like it cost her something to give it. She walked to her room and got dressed without a word. The owl sweater again, grey tights, mismatched socks, stars and clouds. Her small armour carefully chosen. I packed the folder with steady hands. Her raccoon went on top, tucked under the flap. She waited at the door in her sneakers, already double-knotted. I asked if she was ready. She didn't speak, she just looked at me and it was enough. Riverstone looked like a nursery school, not a place for revealing pain. The siding was soft blue, the windows framed with cheerful shutters. A woman named Cara met us at the door. She had no badge, no clipboard, just soft eyes and a cardigan with deep pockets. She knelt in front of Elsie and said gently, "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. You can draw, or sit, or breathe." Elsie didn't respond. She turned to me. I nodded. That was her cue. Cara led her away, and I was taken to a quiet room behind a pane of one-way glass. I didn't sit. I stood with my arms folded, watching my niece settle into a beanbag chair, raccoon in lap. Cara sat across from her. "Would you like to draw?" she asked. "No," Elsie said. "I already know the pictures. I don't want to see them again." And then she began. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate or look for approval. She simply told the truth, plain and complete. She described the quiet game, how stillness meant she was a winner, how moving meant starting over, how Grandma once saw and told her to stop acting difficult. When asked how often it happened, she said, "Mostly when we visited, mostly after dinner." She lifted her sleeve to show a yellow bruise. Cara didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When the session ended, Cara joined me in the hallway. Her voice was quiet, steady. She disclosed clearly, "We'll file the report today. She qualifies for trauma-focused care." I didn't say thank you, I couldn't. I just nodded and she understood. At home, I placed the new report on top of the folder. Its weight felt different now, like it wasn't just for protection, but for truth. Later that afternoon, Marissa called. "We're scheduled for court tomorrow at 9, she said. Layla's attorney is fighting it. They're bringing in a psychologist, Dr. Kane. He's not licensed in this state, but they'll try to use him to question your stability." I didn't panic. "We'll handle it," I replied. That evening, I let Elsie pick her outfit. She chose the same cardigan buttoned to the top and laid out her mismatched socks with quiet precision. "What if they don't believe me?" she asked. I sat beside her and replied, "Then I'll speak until they do." She didn't say anything else. She just leaned her head against my shoulder and stayed there. The next morning, the courthouse felt colder than I remembered. Marissa met us just past security, binder in hand. "They'll come at you hard," she said. "Let the evidence speak. Don't give them emotion to twist." I nodded. When the recording played, the room froze. Layla's voice came first. Don't let her say too much. Then Delilah's. If he goes down, we all do. Then Elsie's. But it hurts. And finally the sound of a slap. The judge's face didn't change. She turned to the opposing counsel and asked if they still wished to proceed. Their lawyer stammered. Marissa slid forward the disciplinary record. Dr. Kane isn't licensed in this jurisdiction, she stated clearly. The judge gave a single nod. I've heard enough, she said. Emergency guardianship is awarded to Caroline Hart. Contact with the mother and maternal grandmother is suspended pending investigation. Outside in the hallway, Elsie sat beside me on a wooden bench, her feet barely grazing the floor. She didn't clutch her raccoon. She just looked up at me and asked, Did they believe me? I took her hand and met her gaze. Yes, I said. They did. And for the first time, she didn't ask again. Even after the judge left and the hallway began to clear, Elsie sat beside me like the floor might shift beneath her if she moved too soon. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. Just stared straight ahead at the courtroom door, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her little shoulders curved inward like she was still waiting to be called back in to defend herself. I didn't rush her. I knew the sound of relief could sometimes feel like a trap, especially after you've learned to live in the silence that follows every unspoken fear. When she finally turned to me and asked, Did they believe me? I told her yes. As calmly and clearly as I could, no flinch, no hesitation, just the truth. Because she needed to hear it from someone who wouldn't break under the weight of her question. She didn't smile, but the way her fingers unclenched made something inside me release too. I squeezed her hand once, then stood, offering her the space to rise if she was ready. She stood without a word, still clutching her raccoon, and we walked out together. I didn't take us home right away. The idea of returning to our small rental felt too abrupt, like shutting a door on something that hadn't finished being said. I drove without speaking, letting the rhythm of the road fill the silence between us. Eventually, instinct led me toward the old neighborhood park, the one with the cracked sidewalks and the single-tired swing that creaked even without wind. Elsie knew where we were without asking. She opened her door and walked towards the same bench we used to visit before bedtime meant fear and not just pajamas. She didn't swing, she didn't run. She just sat, knees drawn up, eyes on the brittle trees that had yet to bloom. I sat beside her. We said nothing for a long time. Then finally she asked, So, are we done? I thought about it. I thought about everything that still waited for us in paper files and pending hearings. I thought about the folder sitting on our kitchen counter, thick with drawings and statements and recordings, and I said, Not done, but not alone anymore. She didn't respond, but she rested her head lightly against my arm. And we sat like that, until the air chilled enough to send us home. Back at the house, the light through the kitchen window was soft and gold, casting long rectangles across the floor. Elsie went straight to her art table without prompting. She pulled out a blank page, chose a pencil, and began to draw. No red lines, no boxes, no shadows in corners, just a window with curtains and two stick figures standing beside a bed, one taller than the other. I didn't ask who they were. She didn't offer, and that, somehow, felt like trust. That night she climbed into her own bed. She lined up her stuffed raccoon beside her pillow and whispered something I couldn't hear. I didn't ask. I just kissed her forehead and left the door cracked open like she'd asked me to weeks before. This time not because she feared the dark, but because she wanted to see the hallway. That difference mattered. The next morning, a letter waited in the mailbox. No return address, just slanted cursive that tugged something old in my chest. Rachel, my aunt. The one who hadn't come to a family holiday in over a decade. Inside was a single line. If you need someone to tell the truth, I will. I folded the note and slid it into the folder without a word. Truth was gaining volume, one voice at a time. Elsie came into the kitchen in mismatched socks, dragging her feet in a way that felt more like habit than fatigue. She didn't ask for cartoons. She didn't ask to stay home. She just poured cereal and sat down. I asked gently, "Do you want to talk about anything?" She shook her head. Then after a pause, she said, "If they ask me to say it again, will I have to?" I leaned down, eye to eye. "Only if you want to, and never alone." She nodded slowly. Her hand moved toward her pencil box, and she picked out a soft blue. The sky. That afternoon I received a call from Anna. The guardianship motion had been received and assigned to a judge. Layla's attorney had filed a formal opposition, claiming psychological manipulation and requesting a custody evaluator. Anna's voice stayed calm. "They're pulling in a therapist," she said. "One of theirs. But we're prepared. Let them try." I thanked her, though my chest tightened the way it always did when strangers were allowed to dissect our lives. Elsie made another drawing that night. 4 stick figures. One clearly me, one clearly her. One small with a guitar. I assumed it was her memory of my dad. The last figure stood near the edge of the page. Eyes wide. No mouth. "Is that Grandma?" I asked. She nodded without looking up. She watches sometimes, but she doesn't say anything. I didn't press. I let the paper stay where it was, next to her dinner plate, like a quiet guest at our table. Later, as I tucked her in, she asked, "Do I have to draw the scary ones again?" I smoothed her blanket and said, "Only if it helps." She looked at the ceiling for a while, then whispered, "Maybe I'll draw dreams instead." Her eyes closed not long after, breathing even. I stayed in her doorway long enough to memorize the sound. I didn't sleep much. I sat on the couch, folder open in my lap, flashlight haloing the pages that now made up our case. Her voice, my notes, legal filings, photos, letters. Not a story. A record. A truth no longer afraid to be seen. And sometime around 4 in the morning, I knew what we had to do next. We wouldn't just respond to their objections. We'd assert our right to peace. Not because they gave it to us, but because we had earned it. And this time, we weren't asking. The morning after I told myself we wouldn't ask anymore, I woke long before the alarm. The house was still. Not quiet in the fearful way it used to be, but in the kind that feels earned, like a breath after holding it too long. The sky outside was a pale slate. I sat at the kitchen table, folder beside me, legal pad in front of me, and a cup of coffee slowly cooling between my hands. I began writing a list, not of groceries or things to fix, but of what I wanted Elsie to always know was hers. Safety, choice, voice, home. 4 promises I never should have needed to write down. But now, they felt like everything. By 8, I called Anna. Her voice came through steady even. The hearing date had been moved up, she said, and Layla's team had requested psychological evaluations. Of me and of Elsie. "They're looking for leverage," she said. "They want to claim emotional instability. Make this about you instead of what happened." I felt the old panic surface, but only for a moment. I told her, "Let them. We won't bend." Elsie padded into the kitchen soon after. She wore one sock, her shirt backward, and carried her raccoon like a shield. She didn't speak, just climbed into the chair beside me, grabbed a crayon, and began drawing. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't peek. Some mornings don't need words, just presence. That afternoon, I received an email from Miss Vera. She said Elsie had asked if she could visit just to finish reading a poem they'd started about stars and quiet hiding places. I said yes. I didn't tell Elsie she was coming. I wanted it to feel like a visit, not another test. Miss Vera arrived before sunset. She wore a soft grey sweater and held a well-loved book instead of a clipboard. She greeted Elsie with a small wave and sat on the couch like she belonged there. Elsie didn't hesitate. She moved to her side, legs folded, raccoon between them like a quiet listener. I stayed near the hallway, pretending to check the mail but really just listening. Their voices were soft, unhurried. And then I heard it. A laugh. Quick. Light. Real. It wasn't loud, but it made my throat tighten with something like hope. After Miss Vera left, Elsie didn't get up right away. She stayed curled on the couch, clutching the book in her lap. Then she looked at me and asked, "Will I have to see Grandma again?" I told her the truth. Only if the judge says so, and even then we'd be there. She nodded once, then whispered. She saw everything. She still didn't stop it. I didn't know how to answer, so I sat down beside her, pulled the blanket over our shoulders, and let the weight of that settle in the silence. The next morning, a therapist called, court-appointed. Her voice was polite, practiced, with just enough warmth to keep me from bristling. She wanted to meet Elsie. I looked her up while we spoke. No ties to Layla's side. No red flags. I said yes. Friday morning. Elsie didn't resist. When I told her about it, she simply said, "Okay." I reminded her it wasn't a test. She didn't have to share anything she didn't want to. She nodded again, then went back to colouring. She had started drawing fields. Open ones. Sunflowers, sometimes marigolds. Always something growing. Thursday passed quietly. We made lunch together, grilled cheese and apple slices. We planted a few more flowers in the back. Soil still cold, but manageable. I told her stories about her toddler years. How she once tried to kiss a snowman. How she clapped every time a microwave beeped. She giggled softly, then curled up on the couch and fell asleep before dinner, raccoon nestled under one arm, her face untroubled. Friday arrived fast. We drove to the clinic, both quiet. The office was painted in soft greens and blues, no harsh lighting. Dr. Keating met us in the lobby. She crouched to Elsie's level, spoke directly to her. "Want to see my art wall?" she asked. Elsie hesitated, then nodded. They disappeared through a side door, and I sat with my hands clenched in my lap, listening to the clock tick in uneven rhythm. When they returned, Dr. Keating gave me a reassuring smile. She did well, talked about drawing, flowers and dreams, and she asked if marigolds bloom in winter. I thanked her. In the car, Elsie told me she had sparkly stickers on her lamp. I smiled. "That's important," I said. She nodded like it really was. That night, after dinner, Elsie handed me a new drawing. It showed a door, just barely open, with a tiny figure peeking out. Outside, a garden full of flowers. At the bottom, in uneven, careful print, she'd written, "Waiting is quieter now." I didn't ask her to explain. I just kissed her temple and whispered, "Mine too." Before bed, she asked if I could read the poem again, the one Miss Vera brought. I read it slowly, each line like a step down into calm. When I finished, she whispered, "Do dreams ever get tired of waiting?" I answered softly, "No, baby. I think they learn patience." Like we did. For the first time in weeks, she fell asleep with her hands empty. The raccoon rested beside her pillow untouched. And as I stood in the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall, I realized the rain outside had started again. Only this time it didn't feel like a warning. It sounded like something learning to be gentle again, like us. The week after Elsie's session with Dr. Keating moved slowly, not because nothing happened, but because everything we did carried weight. Even the smallest choices felt louder than they used to. When she picked blue over pink socks or left the raccoon on the shelf instead of her bed, I took notice, not because I feared something was wrong, but because it meant she was making decisions for herself again. That, in itself, was a kind of healing I hadn't known how much I needed to witness. Anna called midweek with an update. Layla's lawyer had submitted the evaluation request formally, with a statement accusing me of fostering emotional alienation and saviour delusions. Anna's tone didn't shift, but I could tell she was irritated. "It's all buzzwords," she said, "designed to plant doubt. We expected it." I asked if we needed to do anything. She replied, "We already are, by being steady, by not reacting to every bait." That word, steady, stuck with me. It became a mantra I carried through the day, whispered under my breath when fear tried to slip back in. When Elsie had trouble falling asleep, I sat on the floor beside her bed and traced soft circles over the edge of her quilt until her breathing slowed. When she asked to walk home from school instead of riding the bus, I didn't hesitate. I let her try. She needed to believe in her own feet again. One evening, while folding laundry, she held up a pale yellow shirt and said, "I wore this at the barbecue, the one with the yellow balloons." Her voice didn't catch. It was flat, observational. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from awe that she could speak of it. I asked what else she remembered. Just the ketchup, she said. It wouldn't come out of the bottle, so I shook it too hard and it splattered everywhere. She smiled a little. So did I. We folded the shirt and moved on. The next morning, I found a letter taped to our door. No envelope. Narrow handwriting slanted like it had been written in a hurry. It read, "You think you know the whole story, but there's more. If you're brave enough to hear it, meet me Sunday. Noon. Bench near the rose garden." No signature. No clue. I stared at the paper for minutes, trying to hear a voice in the ink. My first instinct was fear, but there was something else buried in the lines, an echo of remorse. I didn't show it to Elsie. I tucked it into the file with everything else and circled Sunday on the calendar in pencil. That Saturday, Elsie asked if we could go to the library. We hadn't stepped into a public place together in weeks, not without a plan. But this time, I let us be spontaneous. She walked through the aisles like she was remembering how to be a child again, fingers tracing book spines, whispering titles under her breath. She found a book about seeds and roots and asked if we could plant something bigger than marigolds. "Maybe pumpkins," she said. "They take up space." I told her that sounded perfect. Sunday arrived with heavy clouds and the kind of wind that threads under your coat. I told Elsie I had to meet someone about the case and asked if she'd feel okay staying with Miss Vera for a while. She nodded and didn't ask questions. That trust, the kind that doesn't need reassurance, still catches me off guard. The rose garden bench was empty when I arrived. I sat with my hands clasped in my lap and listened to the wind rustle through the dormant bushes. When footsteps approached, I knew the gate before the face. Rachel, my aunt. My mother's sister, the one who vanished from our lives a decade ago after a disagreement no one explained. She looked older than I remembered, but somehow smaller too. She stood in front of me for a long moment before saying, "I wasn't sure you'd come." I told her I almost didn't. That was all it took. She sat down beside me slowly, carefully, like even sitting was a kind of confession. Then she handed me a photograph. A birthday party long forgotten. A picnic table, paper hats, juice boxes. Elsie sat on the edge, younger, half smiling. And next to her, just in frame, was Ben. "I saw something that day," Rachel said. "I didn't understand it, but I felt it. I told your mother. She told me I was being dramatic." Her hands trembled slightly. "So I left. I thought silence kept the peace, but it only kept me out of the way. I asked her why now. She looked at me, really looked. Because I saw you choose truth. I saw a child finally being heard. And I realized my silence helped all of this grow." She paused, then added, "I'll testify. If you need me, I'll stand with you." I didn't speak right away. I studied Elsie's posture in the photo, turned slightly, eyes averted, arms drawn in. I'd seen that shape in her sleep. In her drawings. I told Rachel Anna would contact her. As she rose to leave, she reached out and gently squeezed my shoulder. It was more than I'd expected. When I picked up Elsie, she ran into my arms like she'd never feared losing me. I held her tight, and for the first time in weeks, I let my shoulders drop. That night, she placed a drawing on the fridge, a wide tree with deep roots and a small figure nearby, holding a watering can. "That's me," she said, "helping it grow." I kissed her forehead and told her, "It's already growing, baby, right here." And she nodded like she'd always known. The morning after I met Rachel, the air in our home felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but stiller, like everything had stopped holding its breath. I sat at the kitchen table sorting documents again, court notices, drawings, clinic notes, and timelines printed from emails. None of it felt new, but somehow each paper now carried more weight. I wasn't organising just for the judge anymore. I was doing it for Elsie, so she could someday know I never stopped trying to make sense of the chaos that landed in her lap without permission. Across from me, Elsie pulled a blank envelope from the drawer and started drawing on its back with coloured pencils worn down to stubs. Her knees tucked beneath her, brow furrowed in focus. At first I thought she was sketching flowers, but as I leaned closer I saw the outline of her old room, the window with a bent frame, the crooked dresser. In the corner of the page, shaded heavily, sat a figure on the edge of a bed. It had no face, just a slouch, and the suggestion of hands folded tight in its lap. I didn't interrupt. I just let her draw. That afternoon, Anna called. Her voice was steady but urgent. Layla's attorney filed for expedited deposition and temporary return of custody, she said. They're building a case that you've influenced Elsie to fabricate. They're using your advocacy history as proof of bias. She paused. They're coming fast. They want to shift the story. I asked what we had. She told me, enough to hold the line, not enough to end it. Not yet. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with Elsie's drawing in my lap, lights low, TV off. The faceless figure haunted me, not because I didn't recognize it, but because I did. Every time she flinched or shrank from sound, that shadow lived just beneath her skin. Courts wanted details, clean statements. But trauma didn't offer neat timelines. It spiraled, quiet, messy, persistent. 2 days later, Miss Vera called. Her voice was cautious. Elsie left her tablet, she said. I turned it on to charge, and a voice memo started playing. I didn't mean to listen, but it just kept going. I asked what was on it. She hesitated. Her mother threatening her. Then something else. A slap, I think. You should hear it. The tablet sat in a worn red case with a peeling sticker. I hit play at Vera's kitchen table. First, soft rustling, then Layla's voice, cold, sharp. Keep talking like that at school, and they'll take you away forever. A pause. Then Elsie's voice, quiet. But it hurts. A sharp crack followed, the kind of sound that sticks to your ribs long after it fades. I sent the recording to Anna and Marcia that night. 30 minutes later, we were on a call. This helps, Anna said. It confirms emotional coercion and physical abuse. Marcia added, to seal this, we still need Elsie's words, spoken to someone qualified. Not the court. Yet. I hated asking more of her, but I knew the truth couldn't speak for itself. It needed someone willing to give it voice. The next morning, I made pancakes. A small change, but Elsie noticed. She smiled faintly while pushing syrup into the center of her plate. I waited until her plate was nearly empty before I brought it up. I heard something on your tablet, I said gently. She didn't stop eating but tensed slightly. I'm not mad, I said. I just want you to feel safe. She set the fork down. It makes my chest feel weird, she whispered. I nodded. You don't have to listen. Ever. But if you want to talk to someone again, to someone who truly listens, we can. She looked up at me. Will it help? Yes, I said. More than you know. After a pause, she nodded. Then okay. That afternoon, we returned to Riverstone. The same fish tank bubbled, same lavender scent in the hall. The waiting room felt the same, but Elsie did not. She walked beside me instead of behind. She chose a different chair. She held her drawing pad like armor. Dr. Keating welcomed her with a warm nod and led her into the therapy room while I stayed outside, watching the shadows of their movement under the door crack. 40-7 minutes passed. I counted every one. When the door opened again, Elsie stepped out first. Her cheeks were flushed, but her posture was strong. Dr. Keating followed with a clipboard. She spoke clearly, she told me. She remembered without prompting. She named names, recounted events, and never looked to me for reassurance. These are her memories, not implanted ones. Her statement will hold. In the car, Elsie stared out the window for a while before she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a folded paper. I opened it carefully. A new drawing. One figure standing alone in the middle of a white page, arms lifted gently, palms open, no background, no shadows. Underneath, in faint pencil, I'm still growing. And in that moment, I realized I was too. The morning light crept in gently through the blinds, casting long, soft shadows on the kitchen tiles. Everything looked as it always had. Mugs by the sink, the sound of the fridge humming. A half-written grocery list pinned to the fridge, but everything felt shifted. I moved with quiet purpose, washing the same plate twice, unable to stop retracing my steps. My mind wouldn't settle. It circled a single thought, fragile and sharp as glass. Something new was about to break. The call came just after 8. I recognized Miss Green's number before I picked up. Her tone was steady, measured like someone balancing truth and care. She said Elsie had forgotten her school tablet in the reading nook. When I opened it to charge it, she added, an audio recording started playing. It didn't seem intentional, but it's something I think you need to hear. The way she said something sent a chill down my spine. I thanked her, hung up, and stood in the kitchen staring at the faucet, water still running. Then I shut it off, grabbed my coat, and left the house. The drive to school was short, but the silence inside the car felt stretched. I replayed her words in my head again and again, trying to prepare for what I might hear, but no amount of guessing could prepare me for truth captured without intention. When I arrived, Miss Green met me in the hallway and handed me the device. "Take your time," she said quietly, before returning to her office. I got back into my car, locked the doors, and opened the tablet. There was only one voice memo in the folder. I tapped play. The first few seconds were unremarkable, ambient room noise, the shuffle of movement. Then Layla's voice, clipped sharp. "Don't let her say too much at school." My mother's followed, low and cold. "If she keeps flapping her mouth about that man, he'll end up in jail. Then we all lose." I stopped breathing. Then came Elsie's voice. "But it hurts." The sentence barely made it to the microphone. It was followed by a slap, clear, deliberate, and a sound I now recognized with sick familiarity, my niece's stifled sobbing. She hadn't meant to record it, but the device had captured what no one had believed. It was no longer just her word against theirs. I sat there frozen, hands trembling. Then, almost mechanically, I opened the voice memo app on my own phone and recorded the playback. I saved the file, labeled it clearly, and uploaded it twice. Once to the cloud, once to an encrypted folder I'd set up weeks ago. Then I texted Marcia. "I have a new recording. It confirms everything." She called within seconds. Her voice was all business. "Send it now. This is enough to justify an emergency custody hearing. Can you be in court by tomorrow morning?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." When I got home, the weight of what I'd heard lingered in the air like a pressure system. I printed the transcript, collated it with the older documentation, and placed it all in a hardback folder. I packed it into the worn leather bag I hadn't used since my shelter days. It smelled like old paper and time, and now it would carry the most important case I'd ever brought forward. That afternoon, Elsie came home like nothing had changed. She took off her shoes, set down her backpack, and quietly began setting up the Uno deck. We played 2 rounds in near silence. She didn't ask what I'd done that day, and I didn't volunteer the details. She watched me closely, though, like she was looking for something unspoken. Afterward, we made grilled cheese and tomato soup and curled up on the couch to watch cartoons she barely looked at. When she fell asleep, I stayed up reviewing the transcripts again. The words weren't just painful, they were patterned, rehearsed, a defense passed down like a family heirloom. I backed up the files once more and wrote out a timeline by hand. The old desk drawer clicked shut around the originals like a vault. Before bed, I checked on her. She was curled towards the wall, the raccoon plush tucked tightly beneath her chin. Her breath came slow, even. I lingered there, longer than usual, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, wondering how many times she'd fallen asleep like this, small, silent, and afraid. Not anymore. In the dark hallway, I leaned against the wall and let the quiet press into me, not as a threat, but as resolve. I wasn't afraid of what court would bring. I wasn't afraid of facing them again. I was only afraid of what might have happened if Elsie had never said anything. Tomorrow we would walk into that courtroom. Not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for truth. And this time, she wouldn't be whispered away. She would be heard. We arrived at the courthouse just as morning sunlight skimmed the steps, casting long shadows across the stone like a slow procession of memories. Elsie walked close, her hand slipping into mine without a word. She wore the cardigan she picked herself, buttoned all the way up, one sleeve constantly falling over her hand. I didn't fix it. She needed control in a place that felt like it could swallow her whole. The building felt colder inside, its polished floors echoing each step. I checked us in at the window, then sat beside her on a bench near the far wall. The folder of evidence rested on my knees like a living thing, warm with the weight of truth. Marcia arrived soon after, composed as always, a woman built for rooms like this. She reviewed the documents again, even though we both knew she had them memorized. When the judge called our case, we rose together. The courtroom wasn't grand, but it held attention like stretched wire. Judge Miller presided. Older, calm, the kind of face that revealed nothing. She looked like she'd seen every version of family and wasn't surprised by any of them. Marcia began with the facts. She submitted the audio recording from Elsie's tablet and requested to play it aloud. The judge nodded, and the sound filled the room. Layla's voice came first, sharp, cold, then my mother's, steadier but harder. If she keeps flapping her mouth about that man, he'll go to jail, then we all lose. Then Elsie's voice, trembling. But it hurts. A pause followed by the unmistakable slap. Her muffled crying wasn't loud, but it swallowed the room whole. No one moved. Even the clerk froze. It wasn't just evidence, it was the sound of a secret becoming impossible to ignore. Marcia submitted the transcript next, followed by school reports, medical documentation, and statements from her teacher and counsellor. She laid everything out without drama, just the cold shape of what had happened. The judge turned to me. I stood slowly, hands still at my sides. I spoke plainly, telling her what I had witnessed. Elsie's drawings, her reactions, the way her voice broke when she whispered things that no child should know. I said the words not for pity but for clarity, not with outrage but with weight. Layla sat across from me, unmoving. My mother, expression blank, didn't even look my way. Their lawyer tried to redirect, implied projection, emotional manipulation, claimed I was trying to save someone to make sense of my past. Marcia countered calmly, submitting a letter from the school counsellor and an affidavit from Miss Green. The judge took it all in, no reaction betraying her thoughts. She then asked Elsie if she wanted to speak. I turned toward her, ready to step in, but Elsie stood on her own. Her voice was quiet, but she didn't stammer. I want to live with Aunt Lila, she said. I feel safe. I don't want to go back. That was all. Nothing rehearsed, no tears, just the truth handed over without decoration. The judge recessed for 20 minutes. We stepped into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind us like the end of a chapter. Elsie sat beside me, her head resting against my arm. I said nothing, didn't ask how she felt. She didn't need questions. She needed presence. I gave her that. When we returned, Judge Miller spoke clearly. Emergency guardianship was granted to me, effective immediately. Visitation revoked for Layla pending further review. A restraining order put in place against both her and my mother. A court recommendation for trauma-focused counselling. The language was clinical, but the meaning was life-changing. We stepped back into daylight. The sky had softened, and the wind tugged gently at our coats. Elsie reached for my hand again. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just looked up at me, waiting. I crouched to her level and said, "We're safe today. Tomorrow we keep going." She nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. We walked to the car slowly, not as escapees, not as victims, just two people who had chosen to stay standing. The morning after the hearing, Elsie hovered near the kitchen table, her eyes scanning the chair before she climbed up. I placed a dish towel across the seat without a word, the same way I had for days now, and she offered a tiny nod. Her silent thank you. She wasn't avoiding breakfast, but she wasn't eating it either. Her spoon moved in slow, methodical circles, chasing cereal through a puddle of milk. I didn't push her to talk. I knew that kind of stillness wasn't silence. It was a mind sorting what it was finally allowed to feel. After the dishes were cleared, she wandered into the living room and gathered her crayons. She sat cross-legged on the rug, a fresh sheet of paper before her, and began drawing with the kind of quiet focus that belonged more to survival than creativity. I watched from the hallway, folding laundry, pretending not to hover. her brow furrowed and the tip of her tongue peeked out as she worked, eyes locked on each line. When she finished, she looked at the picture for a long moment, then turned it toward me. This one was different. There was no red streaks or black scribbles, just a house, a crooked chimney, two stick figures under a yellow sun holding hands in front of tall purple flowers. "That's you and me," she said softly, then tapped one of the blooms. "Those are the sunflowers." I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat. For a moment, we both looked at the page like it might breathe. There was a third figure too, distant and boxed in with thick grey lines. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. She stared at it with something unreadable, then got up and walked away. I slid the drawing into the manila folder I kept now, the one that had become both archive and shield. Later that day, I called Marcia and described the picture. She listened in silence, then asked me to bring it in. "If she's starting to process the rest, we may be dealing with more than one name," she said. I knew what she meant. Uncle Ben had been at those dinners too, always with a coin trick or a wink that felt too deliberate in hindsight. The thought chilled me, but I thanked her and promised to follow up. That evening, as I loaded dishes, Elsie returned with another picture. This time there were no people, just a chair, the old dining chair, with jagged lines across the seat and a thick red X cutting through the middle. She didn't speak, just laid it on the counter and turned to leave. I stared at it for a moment, then reached for the folder again. The act of filing it away felt sacred, like placing another piece of the truth into something that could finally hold it. She didn't need to talk. Not yet. Her drawing spoke louder than any whisper, and I had learned to listen in colour and shape. In her silence there was movement. In her quiet, a kind of rebuilding had begun. And while I couldn't name how long it would take or where it would lead, I knew this much. She had begun to tell the story on her own terms. That meant we were no longer stuck in the moment that broke her. We were moving forward. Together. The folder on my desk had grown thicker. But it wasn't just paper inside. It was memory, grief, and the slow climb of truth. Every drawing Elsie gave me, every counsellor note, every form signed with my steady, deliberate hand, it all pressed together, heavy in the quiet hours between school drop-off and court dates. That morning, Elsie stirred oatmeal without eating, her eyes on the steam like it might tell her what came next. I didn't force her to talk. The quiet between us was something earned, not empty. I'd learned to hear the things she didn't say. After school, while unpacking her bag, I found another folded drawing nestled between math worksheets. I opened it carefully, preparing myself for whatever she'd poured into the page. It was a table this time, the same square table from Grandma's house, and seated around it were 4 stick figures, one with glasses, one with long hair, one small with pigtails, and one taller figure with the name Ben written beneath it. A thick red X slashed through the centre of the table. It wasn't rage, it was resignation. Not panic, but certainty. I stared at it for a long time before slipping it into the folder with the rest. It belonged there, part of the growing archive she was building through shapes and colours. That evening, I called Marcia and described it. She went quiet on the other end, the kind of quiet lawyers use when they're calculating. "It adds weight," she finally said. "If she's naming people, the DA needs to know." The next morning, I got the email, an update from the district attorney's office. A second investigation was now open, and Ben was officially named. The wording was sterile, procedural, but I felt it like a wind change, sharp and necessary. I printed it out and placed it in the folder. My hands shook just a little. Not with fear, with something more like reverence. Elsie didn't want to talk that day. She curled up on the couch under the quilt, the same one stitched by the hands of the woman who had once looked the other way. She still chose it, because trauma doesn't ask for logic. It clings to the familiar, even when the familiar cuts. I sat beside her and watched the sun make long, soft shadows across the carpet. She finally looked at me and asked, "Will I have to tell them again?" I didn't lie. "Maybe," I said. "But you'll never have to do it alone." Her eyes held mine for a breath longer than usual, then she nodded and returned her gaze to the window. Later that night, as she slept with her arms wrapped tightly around her raccoon, I stayed up sorting papers, checking calendar reminders, reading and rereading everything I had already memorized. I wasn't just her guardian on paper, I was her record keeper, her translator, her echo. And when she couldn't carry the weight of remembering, I would carry it for her, quietly and completely. That's how you love someone out of the dark. Not with noise, not with demands, but with the steady promise that no one's rewriting the story behind their back. Only forward. Only with her voice at the center of it. The final week before the next hearing unfolded with a strange rhythm, equal parts stillness and motion, as though our little house had learned to exhale after months of bracing for impact. Each morning, Elsie laced her sneakers without being asked, placed her raccoon by the window to watch the day pass, then met me at the door with that quiet readiness she wore like armor. She still didn't talk much about what was coming, but the way she moved said enough. She wasn't waiting to be hurt again. She was moving through a world that had proven it could break and still let you keep going. I'd stopped trying to plan our days like defense strategies. Instead, I began letting space exist between things. We planted tomatoes in mismatched pots by the back fence. She named them like pets. I made pancakes on a Wednesday just because she asked. We watched the same movie 3 times in 2 days because it made her laugh out loud, and that laugh, that unguarded joy, reminded me why I'd started this battle in the first place. Then the school counsellor called, not to report an incident, not to flag behaviour, but to say that Elsie had turned in a self-portrait during art time. A smiling girl in a yellow sweater, standing under a tree next to a stick figure labelled Aunt Lila. There were no shadows in the picture, just sky, wide and blue. I hung up and stared out the kitchen window for a long time after. There were moments when the past still curled around us, but they were no longer the only story being told. That evening, while Elsie built a city from coloured blocks on the living room rug, I reread the statement I planned to submit in court. It wasn't dramatic, just steady. Facts, evidence, timelines. But I added something else this time, a sentence I hadn't been brave enough to include before. She is safe with me, not only because I protect her, but because she trusts me with her truth. I printed it, signed it, and slid it into the folder with everything else that mattered. The day before the hearing, Elsie asked if she could come with me. I hesitated, then said yes, but only if she felt okay sitting outside the courtroom with one of Marcia's assistants. She nodded. I don't want to talk this time, she said. I just want to know what happens. It wasn't fear I heard in her voice. It was ownership. She had lived this story. She wanted to see how it landed. That night, she fell asleep on the couch again, her drawings scattered across the coffee table like breadcrumbs from a path she'd built herself. I didn't move them. I let them stay. Because maybe healing didn't arrive with fanfare or headlines. Maybe it came in moments like these, unremarkable to the world, but monumental to the two of us who knew what it meant just to breathe without flinching. And as I sat beside her in the dark, listening to the soft sound of her breath deepening with sleep, I realized something I hadn't been able to believe for months. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living, on our own terms, together. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's where courage begins, quiet, steady, and stronger than anyone expects. This story wasn't about revenge, but about reclaiming safety, voice, and the right to be believed. For every child who wasn't heard, and every adult who decided to stand beside them, this is a reminder. Healing isn't loud, but it's powerful. And love, the kind that stays, that listens, can rewrite even the darkest legacy. If this spoke to you, comment and share it with someone who's still finding their own voice.